Thank you. I should like to start by thanking the organisers for inviting me to represent Tate Modern at this distinguished event, which has allowed me to return to the Pushkin after too long a time, after many years. I've chosen change as my theme today because it is structured into our activities at Tate Modern. Like most collections of modern and contemporary art, the Tate collection continues to expand. And as Matisse said of adding colour to a painting, the introduction of any new element changes the whole. Within the galleries, where the collection is shown at Tate Modern, we change around 30 displays each year, which constitutes around half of the spaces available to the collection. At the same time, just as it is in the case of any museum, we seek to delay change in the works in our care. Indeed, these actions are interconnected, and we take works off display in order to extend their life for future generations. As a result, the desires to make and to arrest or delay change raise questions that we face on a regular basis, both knowingly and unknowingly. So one might begin by saying that in the life of the museum there is a tension between formality and flexibility, between permanence and change. This is evident to different degrees in different places, and broadly it might be seen as most stable in collections perceived as encyclopedic, and most unstable in collections of contemporary art, or alternatively one might say most balanced and most dynamic. One of the interesting concerns for both types of museum is that each seeks something of the other, dynamism in permanence and balance in enacting change. When Tate Modern opened in 2000, we made a fundamental shift in the way in which the Tate collection was displayed. The new emphasis on thematic displays so disguised chronology that many believed we had eradicated it from our thinking. It needs to be recalled that the displays were, and continue to be, drawn from collections of art made after 1900, so that chronology could, in some sense, be telescoped together for intensity. The scheme allowed us to show how artists often engage in conversations across time as they respond to earlier generations through the creation of the artwork itself. And this may reflect their place in the world and their relation to a whole range of material that has inspired and challenged them. Nevertheless, the perception in 2000 was that chronology had been abandoned. In fact, it was more the case that we were thinking differently about its use in telling the stories of recent art through the works that were then in the collection. To rethink the presence of chronology allowed us to go beyond the assumptions of sequences and of influence, a concept that still needs to be treated with extreme circumspection. One example may serve as a cautionary tale in this respect. When Shimamoto Shozo decided to give 2 paintings to the Tate, he wrote to us about his discovery in the 1950s of the power of puncturing the surfaces of his work. Significantly, he added that he then decided to abandon the practice when he discovered the contemporaneous works of Lucio Fontana, as he expected that he, Shimamoto, would be taken to be an imitator of the Italian. Many things are tied up in this story, including interesting reflections onto the zeitgeist of the 1950s. Most immediately, it shows an awareness of the power of chronology, precedence, and influence in the canonical discourse. Underlying all, of course, is the question of Western dominance in telling recent histories, a factor ruefully acknowledged by Shimamoto, but perhaps now able to be recalibrated. Tate Modern's thematic displays of the collection have been conceived deliberately to allow us to tell multiple stories. The displays in 2000 took the classical genres of painting as a point of departure in order to trace contemporary echoes. A subsequent renewal of the way that the collection was shown in 2006 looked at how contemporary artists responded to or against paradigmatic shifts in modernity. In some senses, this directly addressed and unpacked questions of chronology. The sort of stories that we can tell have significantly broadened as we've expanded the holdings of the collection in the lifetime of Tate Modern. A crude but simple measure of this development can be found in looking at the nationalities of the 100 artists included in the A to Z section of the Tate Modern Handbook when it was published in 2000. Understandably, for a major cultural event in Britain, there was a strong showing of British artists, 28 out of the 100. Perhaps equally to be expected is that American and Western European artists were well represented. Two things are striking looking back now. First, that there is only one artist from beyond Europe and America, William Kentridge. And second, that of the 100, only 18 are women. It should be noted that this was not a direct reflection of how the collection was displayed, but it is, nevertheless, a public statement of our position in and on the world in 2000. When we came to reissue the handbook in 2012, the position was evidently different. An increased number of A to Z texts to 170. I think, yes, to 170. Allowed for a wider reach. While the British, Western European and American artists still dominated, the increased number of entries included 49 artists from places previously unrepresented, of which 25 were from outside Europe and North America. In this selection, there were 45 women. These are small steps, but significant ones. The most recent rehang of the whole museum was undertaken in 2015-16 in preparation for the opening of the new Tate Modern in June 2016. The scheme engages with broader themes where art and everyday life meet. There is a particular emphasis on the change that results from the shift to performative works in the 1960s. While these themes are determined by artistic practice, the displays that challenge materials, new media, performance, and so on, are open to ideas and concerns that are easily conveyed to and perhaps equally addressed by our audiences. This is important for a venue with an enormous number of visitors, as we seek to engage with diverse audiences in sharing and understanding the art that we collect and show. Although the Tate Gallery was established in 1897, it only took on the role of collecting modern international art rather belatedly and rather reluctantly, it has to be said, around 100 years ago. In the early days, there were limitations to what could be seen or shown. There were, as always, limitations of funds, and there were what appear in hindsight as limitations in vision, limitations in the awareness of the developments in contemporary practice. As the collection grew somewhat haphazardly, it was also being overtaken by practices that undermined its foundations. These challenges suggest that the museum may be seen to lie in the shared imagination of those whose work is held there, those who make the choices, and those who visit. It is always being rethought and given new meaning by these participants. At Tate, we increasingly want to turn outwards from the singular canonical history towards something more multivalent. This was the major message of the new Tate Modern in 2016. With 60% more space for art, we sought to be more open to our audiences while also bringing them a more diverse art practice. None of this has been achieved overnight, and we're still in a long process of development. Furthermore, this transnational shift is obviously part of a much wider trend among museums of modern and contemporary art. Of course, we pride ourselves on the steps that we've taken so far, but we do not fool ourselves that we are alone in taking them or that the journey is complete. What this meant in the galleries, however, was that the new Tate Modern has provided the opportunity to reveal through the collection a broader picture of the creativity of the world. This reflects something of the multicultural structure of London as well as the audiences that come through our doors. Again, the most recent edition of the Tate Modern Handbook is a measure of this change in the ways in which the collection is announced to the public. The number of single artist entries has now expanded to 300. The British, Western European and American artists continue to dominate, forming more than half the list. However, the impact of the world is exemplified by artists from countries including Benin, Colombia, India, Japan, Lebanon and Sudan. Of the 300 artists, 110 are women. More still needs to be done, but the direction of travel is evident. This revision is part of an appreciation that the established structures have concealed ingrained assumptions. As Shimamoto discerned, our horizons have been limited by habit, bias, and discrimination. This process of research and realization has been salutary and exciting. It was a shift that had to be undertaken consciously and sensitively. We as curators have changed with it, and looking back, it's notable how much this revised thinking has displaced what had been held as a common view of the canon. As I've said, we recognize that we are still just starting out. With consideration, the habitual bias towards the familiar becomes fairly obvious. But we must recognize that the familiar is also reassuring for the public. The nature of an art museum means that well-known and long-admired works in the permanent collection will, for some, tend to outshine the less familiar. Exposure will breed familiarity, but this may be a slow process. The research that we've undertaken in various areas underpins these changes. What is more telling at a very simple level is that the more one looks, the more one sees. A re-examination of historic exhibitions or publications exposes the presence of artists who came to be written out of the wider history. With a new set of eyes, the redisplay of artworks allows for the reconsideration and rewriting of history. If the institution is determined to change the scope of the collection and the range of its displays, there are other areas of change that are perhaps more difficult to encompass, but equally pressing. These include the challenge of material changes affecting individual objects, as well as the associated question of how to collect immaterial works. Just as we've built into our display system an engagement with the artwork that avoids the fixed narrative of orthodox museums, so we've tried to face up to the fact that the artworks themselves are constantly undergoing change. The museum, peopled by inventive brains, inevitably rises to the challenge, finding ways to understand and respond to these changes. Tate has, for instance, just launched a major research project supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation called Reshaping the Collectible When Artworks Live in the Museum. This will explore the challenges arising from time-based media, performative, live and digital art, whose visible life is primarily located through enactment. While music and theatre have conventions of reenactment, these are areas in which the artists engaged with performative practices and the art museums are still finding ways of working. As the museum is a shared space, the audience arrives in the knowledge that the institution is validating the work in one way or another. 45 years ago, the Tate Gallery, as it was then, held its first exhibition to include performative works, the Robert Morris exhibition of 1971. In a way that is now difficult to understand, beyond a misplaced belief that if it was in a museum it must be safe, people who had no circus experience set about walking on tightropes and balancing on wooden sculptures that moved. Legs were broken, and the exhibition was closed after 4 days to be reconfigured. In a way that tells us much about the shift in circumstances and an awareness of the transformations accompanying the passage from the studio to the public realm, Tate Modern revisited Robert Morris's show in 2009. In consultation with the artist and with a range of health and safety advisors, structures were built again, and over one long weekend the public were able to encounter what was called body, space, motion things in the turbine hall. Interaction, now more carefully marshalled, was actively encouraged. If it's hardly surprising that Morris's invitation of audience participation subverted the sedate museum, there are other instances where the material challenges have been less predictable. As a result of working with colleagues on the displays of the collection at Tate Modern, I found myself taking a particular interest in the practical and ethical issues raised by the degradation of artworks. We're all used to the idea of monitoring the lux levels for works on paper so as to decelerate the speed at which they fade. However, what an artist might use to make an artwork is often detached from ideas of posterity. It may simply depend on what is to hand in order to achieve the desired effect. A blowtorch on plastic film leaves an extraordinary surface. Packing tape and photocopies capture a sense of the instant. Constructing an environment out of human hair gives a paradoxical sense of fragility and strength. And then there's the model of a city built out of couscous. All of these works by Henk Peters, Thomas Hirschhorn, Sheila Gouda and Kada Attia present their particular problems for display. They range from the extreme fragility, which ages noticeably in the first two cases, through specialist treatment for the raw material of hair, to the practical series of instructions that allows us to make Attia's piece afresh each time. While these instances were more or less predictable, and they continue to exercise us, so have the instances where when changes were entirely unexpected by the artist. This gave rise to the consideration of these issues in the workshop titled Inherent Vice, the replica and its implications in modern sculpture, which we held in 2007. A prime example in Tate's collection was the case of Nam Gabo. He experimented with plastic, which appeared to be as permanent as glass, and which he could cut and bend in the studio. What he did not reckon with was that the cellulose nitrates and cellulose acetates that he was using in the 1930s would disintegrate. For decades, these plastics remain, or appear to remain, stable. But at a point that remains difficult to predict, because it depends on the chemical makeup of each batch of plastic, they reach a tipping point from which disintegration follows rapidly. I first became aware of this problem when a fragment spontaneously broke off Gabo's Spiral Theme 1941 when it was on display at Tate Modern. It turned out that the different plastics had been moving very, very slowly and pulling against one another until the joint between them reached breaking point. There is, of course, much to be said and investigated about this subject. Since our workshop, there have been related sessions held at the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles called Objects in Transition, at the Hamburger Kunsthalle called Failed Better, and again at Tate Modern, Media in Transition. These discussions have helped to raise the profile of these subjects from a limited and rather anxious concern of conservators to one in which they're joined by curators, artists, and academics. While the observation, experiments, and mitigations continue, so does the degradation. As well as being a constant reminder of the gradual entropic change of the world around us, the challenge points to some of those key issues that lie at the heart of the museum as an institution. If the museum is about the preservation of objects and showing them in circumstances as close to the original format as possible, then these evident changes raise a question about those purposes and practices. One final and recent example may serve to summarize some of these questions. Marwan Reshmoui's Rabah Beirut is a huge relief map of the city of Beirut. The religiously or ethnically determined districts of the city are designated by the sections of the rubber mat, which allows the visitor a sense of the structures and fissures not immediately apparent in the urban fabric. The visitors are also invited to walk on the sculpture, and in this requirement lies the challenge. With the exception of Carl André's metal floor works, there are relatively few works of art that can withstand the attrition that results from being walked over. When we placed this work on display in June 2016 in the new Tate Modern, 1 million visitors passed through the building in the first month. Even if not everyone walked on this work, the figures were beyond the calculations that the artist made when first showing it in Amman in 2008. The transformation brought about by this translation from the studio through the gallery space into the museum establishes, therefore, a radical shift in status and expectation. This happens with every work, but is most readily appreciable with the cases such as these that lie at the extremes. As we continue to extend the reach of our collection and continue to bring these works to the public through our displays, so these extremes are encountered regularly, and we continue to balance the desire for change and the need to resist change. Thank you very much.